Hey everyone, my name is Eric Small. I'm a senior medical animator at Mad Microbe Studios. We do a lot of cellular and molecular animations about what's going on inside of the body. A lot of mechanism of action and mechanism of disease type of animations, showing you problems that are occurring within the body and solutions to rectify those problems within the body. To give you a little bit better idea of the type of work that we do, I invite you to take a look at our demo reel real quick. So now that you've had a chance to see kind of the work that we do, I'm going to jump in today and I want to show you guys some techniques for rigging molecules. Specifically, we're going to be working with this monoclonal antibody, or just antibody. This particular model was sourced from the protein data bank. There's a variety of techniques that you can use to get models like these from the protein data bank, one of which is using a plugin in Cinema 4D directly called EPMV. But there are also a lot of other molecular viewers out on the market. Notably, there is Chimera, as well as VDB. There's a lot of tutorials and demos out there about how to go about using those applications to get these models, so I'm not going to get into that aspect of it today. I'm just going to jump right in and show you a few different rigging techniques that I've used throughout the past to get something like this wobbling around, moving nice and organically on screen. So this technique that we're showing right here is using bend deformers, and I'm going to delete all of these out, and we're just going to start this from scratch so we can show you exactly how all of this is done. So to get started, I've got my antibody right here. I've got it set underneath the subdivision surface, which is currently turned off. I'm just going to zero out the location and rotation of this so we've got a fresh palette to work with. So step one is we've got our antibody, we've got it underneath a null object, which is good practice because if we ever needed to come in and replace this molecule with something else or something slightly different shaped or something like that, easy enough to do without having to reinvent the wheel and reanimate everything. So to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the antibody, hold down Shift, and I'm going to create a bend deformer. And this makes a bend deformer the child of the antibody. I'm going to scale it down, and I'm going to work first on this upper right arm. We'll call this arm 1 right now of the antibody. And what we'll do is we'll go into the object mode. We'll keep length, and we'll check to see which way the bend is going. And of course, it is not going in the correct directions. So we'll switch that over 90 degrees, and now we see that this bend is bending this arm, but we got a little bit of an issue going on. We see that the bend deformer is also affecting the tail down here, and then this other arm over here as we kind of drag its influence. So what we can do is we can restrict the influence of this particular bend deformer to just this arm by using a vertex map. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to point mode, and I'm going to grab my lasso tool. Now I'm showing you where those are right now, but in the future going forward, I have designated hotkeys set up for all of these, and I will be using those instead. If you are curious about how to set those up, you can go to Customization, Command Manager, and then you can just type in exactly what you want to, which shortcut you want. For example, the lasso selection, and you can see right here I have the lasso selection set to Control 3, and that's simply by coming in here and you type in whatever shortcut you want it to be and click Assign. So here I have my selection. I'm going to go to Select, set vertex weights, and we have now the area that is going to be controlled by the bend deformer. Call it arm 1 in the yellow area, and all of the area in the red will not be affected by the bend deformer. In order to do that, now we click on our bend deformer and we drag this vertex map into the fields. And now we see right here immediately we have the ability to adjust the bend deformer, and it's being restricted only to that upper arm. However, we see that there's pretty harsh fall off going on right here because the vertex map is just very abruptly changing from 100% influence to 0 influence. We can change that by, if we go into, click on our antibody, click on our vertex map, I'm going to hit Shift-C, bring up the commander, and I'm going to pull up the paint tool. And we'll set this to smooth, and I'm going to set this to 5 increments, and I'm going to hit Apply All. And you see that transition now is getting, I'll hit it one more time, getting a really nice gradient in there. So now if we start adjusting our bend deformer, it's acting really nicely transitioning between influencing and not influencing. So that's our arm 1. Duplicate this one here, and I'm going to call this arm 2. I'm going to switch to the world axis mode. I'm going to rotate around 180 degrees. 170, 180. Actually, I think that was 190. Let me check. Nope, that was 180. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to move this into position over here so that now this one will control arm number 2. And we see instantly this is still influencing the arm 1. And that's because we only have the one vertex map, and that is the only vertex map that we have, and that's dragged into the field of this arm 2. So let's grab our lasso selection again. Drag around here, and we'll then go in and set the vertex weight to 100. Shift-C to bring up the commander and the paint tool, and I'm going to smooth this out one more time. We'll take this vertex map and we'll hold it over the icon of the first arm 1, and we'll see that replaces it. But we need to go in and we need to label this so we don't confuse ourselves later. And now we have the ability to control arm number 2. Set that back to 0 for the time being. Duplicate this one more time. call this tail. And this time I'm going to rotate it around. I'm going to get out of the world mode here just so I can see where this green y-axis is pointing. We want that pointing straight down. We'll move this over some and rinse and repeat one more time. Go into point mode, grab my lasso selection, and expand that selection out just a touch. Make sure we got everything. Select vertex map, 100%. Shift C. We'll smooth it out a bit. And then we'll bring this in. Let's name this first, and then we'll bring it into the fields and replace that icon right there. So now if we go in and we grab all three of our bend deformers, we can see that all of the bend deformers are working on their respective parts of the antibody. So let's rewind to frame 0, and I will set the strength of all of these to -10. And I will jump ahead in time to frame 72 and just set another keyframe at -10. And then halfway in between frame 36, I'm going to go up to +10. So now if we drag our playhead through, we see that they wobble nicely, but then at 72, everything stops. And what we can do to fix that, instead of setting keyframes over and over and over, if we highlight the values within the timeline here and we go into the after properties of the time track here, we can set this to repeat. Now this is a little bit easier to see if we go into the F curve and see if we can drag that up. Come on, drag up for me. There we go. You see that here's our actual keyed values right here, but then we have this black line right here afterwards that just continues on indefinitely. And that's showing us that we are repeating these keyframes indefinitely. So if we drag this, we see now that it just continually oscillates. Now it looks fine, but it does not look very organic because everything is beating perfectly synchronously. So to fix that, simple matter, we can offset our keyframes ever so slightly, and maybe we'll drag these out a little bit, drag that back to frame 0, we'll drag that out, maybe drag it down, and now as we see everything is moving as we drag the playhead, actually just hit play, and everything's looking good. If we want to jazz this up a little bit more, we can go into our animation tags and add a vibrate tag. And now we've got this antibody just wobbling around in space. Give a nice organic motion, all by just using one tag and 3 deformers that are restricted to each particular limb of this antibody. This particular setup is really good for creating a cloud of molecules, or in this case, a cloud of antibodies, if we were wanting to do just an introductory shot to what this antibody is before we actually move it into the body to show how it's going to fix a problem or how it's going to react to the environment within the body. And one way to do that, we have this one on screen right here, but that's pretty boring. What we can do is let's get rid of this vibrate tag right now because we're not going to need it. We're going to use MoGraph in order to create a cloud of these antibodies and get them wiggling around independently. So I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to create a cloner. And right now we see that the viewport, if I bring up my heads-up display and I turn on frames per second, the frames per second has just plummeted down to less than 5 frames per second. But if we switch this over to render instance, instantly we get almost real-time 30 FPS, 24 FPS back in the viewport. So flipping over to render instance is just a lifesaver in this situation. So I'm going to do one more layer of these antibodies. So now we've got 9 by 3 by 3 by 2 grid array of these particular antibodies. Now this is very geometric looking and not even remotely organic looking. So let's fix that by adding a random effector. And I'm going to highlight all the position locations. I'm going to control and click and drag and adjust all 3 values at once. And we start to see these spreading out. And I'm going to do the same thing with the rotation now as well. This is looking all right, but I don't really like this distribution of these antibodies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the effector tab, and I'm going to change the seed value. And I'm just going to change that around until I get something that I like. This one might work. Yeah, all right, I think this one will work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a camera, and I'm going to set it right here, and I'm going to look through the camera. And I'm going to drop the field of view down so we get a little bit wider field of view. And let's see here, I think I'm kind of liking this, where maybe we can focus on this particular antibody right up here in the foreground. So I'm going to flip to my top view, I'm going to get into my object mode, and I'm going to shorten up the focal distance of this camera so we're focused right here on this particular one right up front. And let's go to our display options and turn on the depth of field, and we're going to drop our physical f-stop value down to 1, and now we see that we've got this depth of field in the viewport right here. Now by just scrubbing through the playhead, we see two things. Number one, they're wobbling, yes, the arms are, but the actual central location of all of these antibodies is remaining the same. You know, they're not jiggling around organically. The other issue is that all of the limbs are beating perfectly synchronously. Now they are randomized in the rotation, so it's a little disguised, but what we can do is if we duplicate this antibody rig here and we grab all the keyframe values beneath that other one, or beneath the second copy that we just made. Let's drag this up a little bit so we can see what we're working with. We'll grab all three of these. Now we know that we're repeating everything afterwards, but if we go in and we repeat everything beforehand, now we have the ability to drag these keyframes forward and set our cloner from iterate mode to random mode. So now we have two different antibody rigs, and it's going to be randomly placing which one we're looking at. So we shouldn't really notice any synchronization between the two models within this cloud of antibodies. So here's our position and rotation random. I'm going to add another random effector, and we'll call this one wobble. This one now, I will set the value, let's say 35 in each direction, and we'll grab the rotation and we'll set it to be about 51. Now, if we hit play, nothing really changes right now, and that is because we need to change random mode from random to noise. And now we start to see them bouncing around all over the place. Now this is a bit fast for my liking, even though we're even playing this back at only 13 frames per second. To get a sense of what this looks like in real time, I'm going to turn off playback all frames, and now we'll play this. It's skipping the frames in between that it can't render in real time. So we get a real sense of how quickly these are moving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the effector tab here. I'm going to turn on indexed mode, and then the animation speed I'm going to drop to 25. Now depending on what we're after, this may even be a little too fast, so we can drop down the strength down to like say 60%. But now we're starting to get some really nice organic motion just by using bend deformers restricted by vertex maps and set into a cloner, and then using two random effectors. If we want to make this look even a little bit more organic, we can add one more effector. We'll add the time effector. And by default, this comes in at a value of 90, which is way too high for what we're after. If I drop that to like 25, now that's starting to look nice and organic, and these are spinning around, but not looking like they're intentionally spinning. They're just kind of drifting organically. So a very simple setup, but very effective for just an antibody cloud or molecular cloud shot where we're just kind of introducing a molecule, but that hasn't been given any sort of environment yet. We're just talking directly about the molecule. Perfect setup to keep this infinitely loopable, because we can continue this going for 420 frames and it will never loop back on itself. The next technique we're going to use is using the old pose morph technique. So in a new scene here, I will deactivate the bend deformers, delete those, and we are left with just our antibody geometry. I'm actually going to also delete out the keyframes. So now we just have it at the origin, and we're all set. In this file, I also have a receptor that I'm going to bring over as well. That will come in a little bit later. So we'll just keep that turned off for the time being. So in order to set up a pose morph, we need to add a pose morph tag. So go to rigging tags, pose morph, and we'll go into points. And this first one will work with the first arm again. So we'll go into the point mode, and I'll grab my lasso tool, and I will select the points of the arm, make sure I only have those. Excellent. And we need to set our pose. So this is the base pose, and we need to set the pose that it's going to move into. Now I want this to bend upwards. So I can't really just go like this. I mean, I guess I could, but that would take a lot of additional fiddling around. So in order to do this, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into soft selection, and I'm going to enable soft selection. And you see right now the influence of this soft selection is everywhere that we've got yellow all over the surface. Well, first off, I don't want it acting all over all of this, so I'm going to drop this down to, say, 10. All right, that's a lot better. But you see that we're still getting some influence right down here on this part of the tail. And the reason for that is that this is being calculated by 10 centimeters in all directions. It's based on the volume. We don't want to act on everything within 10 centimeters all around surrounding the selection. We only want it to act within the surface. So if we activate the surface, we see immediately now that it's only going 10 centimeters past where the surface is connected. Also, we want to rotate this from this area here. We don't want to just rotate it right in the middle. So if we go to our axis, and this can come up whenever you bring up any of your move, rotate, or scale tools. So right now we see that this is right in the middle of our selection. Well, I want to take this and I want to move, look at our little gizmo up here. We want to move this in the negative Z direction so that it is far over as possible. And then also we're going to move it a little bit down. So we'll rotate this up a few degrees, and now we have our rotation. Now instantly we have one issue here. It's ever so slight, but if you look closely at 100%, then come down to 0%, everything looks fine. But if we drag this up, and if I do it quickly enough, you can see that the overall volume of this arm actually decreases when we get approximately to the 50% mark. And that's because by default, the pose morph only interpolates linearly. So it means this point right here compared to where this point is right now only moves in a straight line. Well, we rotated this. So this is not going to actually move in a straight line. This is going to move in an arcing line. And by default, pose morphs don't account for that. But we can get around that. By going into our mixing mode right here, by default, it's relative. If we turn that into rotational mode, now we can choose what points we want this morph to rotate around. So again, this is rotating, and it's rotating up and around like this. So I'm going to grab some points over here, and I'm going to set these points to be the ones that we want this morph to rotate around. So now, if we move this slider, we see that it maintains its volume, and it moves in a rotational arcing path. Beautiful. So I'm going to add another pose morph. We'll call this one arm 2. Grab our lasso tool again. Make the selection over for the second arm. Our soft selection is already set. That's good to go. But we do need to adjust the axis handle. So we're going to move the Z to the positive this time, and we'll move it down a little bit. And we'll move it approximately the same amount that we did last time, which I think was right about 15 degrees. Once again, we need to change this over to be rotational, and we want to set our points that we want to rotate it around. Where would that rotation be oriented from? And select our points. And now we check. Everything is rotating nicely. Awesome. Add one more pose. This time it's going to be the tail. And we'll grab our lasso tool one more time. Start making the selection. And I'm going to shrink this selection a little bit. To do that, I'm pressing the key U, and if you follow down, K is shrink selection. Conversely, Y is to grow the selection. So we're going to add in one more rotational pose morph. This time, let's bring the axis back to 0, and we're going to bring the axis all the way to the top this time. And now we'll move that over about 15 degrees as well. Once again, we got to pick our points that we want this to rotate around, and we'll set this to rotational mode, set it from the points, and now we see we got this nice rotation moving left to right. So we're all set. Now to animate this, very simple. We'll go back to frame 0. I'm going to highlight all 3 of our sliders here. Drag them, control click and drag them, and they all move down to 0. I'll hit record slider. And let's set our timeline to 240, 0 to 240. And we'll go up to about 72. I'm going to set the record slider again, and then go back to 36, and control click and drag all 3 of them up. And instead of actually keyframing them, I'm going to hit record slider. That way we don't get this random extraneous keyframe on the enable disable function here. That can cause problems later on down the road. So if we now highlight these 3, and once again we set them to repeat, if we expand out, let's look at our I guessed it. Let's try one more time. Record slider. There we go. We'll have to do the same thing real quick for these. Apparently when we undid that, it reset the sliders back to 0. So all set. We can see now easily here that this is going from 0 to 100 back to 0, and then that's going to just repeat indefinitely. And we can see that now by scrubbing through the timeline. And we can do the same thing that we did last time. We can grab our keyframes. We can extend them out a little bit, and then we can offset them, and we'll have this just kind of bobbing around, just kind of wobbling around like we would need it to. Now let's actually make this antibody bind to a receptor, because that's where the real magic happens inside the body, is when these antibodies get in. They can deliver medication. They can do a lot of good things. They can inhibit malfunctioning receptor pathways. So let's actually show this binding to a receptor. So let's increase the size of this. We'll bump this up to, like, say 1200, and let's go in the -y. Now we've got this neat kind of organic looking cell surface, what we'll call it. We'll increase the density of the geometry here so we get a little bit more detail on it. Now, the one thing about antibodies is that, we rig this thing in an upright Y shape. You got it roughly approximately a Y right here. Well, they tend to bind actually by their arms. So what we need to do is we actually need to invert this guy, bring him upside down, and now this arm is actually going to come down and it's going to bind to this receptor right here. Now we could start animating with the null object right here set right in the middle of the antibody, but the problem with that is that when you want this to come in and you want it to bind, you need to adjust both the position and the rotation. So if we need to change this angle that it's coming in, we do that. Well, now we need to change the actual location as well. So instead of going through all of that and having the null object right in the middle, I'm going to activate my axis tool over here. I'm going to move this parent null object right to the tip where this is actually going to bind to the receptor. So now as this comes in, we can set this to bind right here, and then we can have this in any orientation that we want. So if we set this up here, set ourselves a keyframe for the position and the rotation, and let's actually set this back to frame 0. And at frame 72, let's have this come down, and I'm going to change the rotation of it. And we'll set our keyframe right here. Now when I'm animating molecules, I don't usually like to have them just come straight in and bind and then that's it. I like to have them come in and pause, just hesitate ever so slightly, just a little bit off of the receptor where they're going to bind. It might be a little far away. Set that keyframe just there. We'll jump up 6 frames or so, and we'll have this come in and it'll bind the rest of the way. So if we look at the motion of it, you see how it comes in kind of slow, and then it binds really quickly right at the end. So if we play this, it comes in and then snaps into place. Good start. We got a little work to do though. Let's look at our dope sheet first, or excuse me, our F-curve sheet here first. We want this to actually snap into place, and by default, these last keyframes right here have some easing applied to them. So I'm going to zero that out. And then for the position of the Y, the majority of this motion the antibody is coming down is coming downward in the Y direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the handles of this keyframe a little bit and just try to get it a little bit to pause just before it snaps into place. I'm actually going to break these tangents here and get a little bit more easing. As that comes in. All right, that's not bad. That's a decent start. But the first issue that I see is that this arm continues to wobble after it's bound. What can we do with that? Well, let's verify. I believe this should be, nope, that's going to be arm number 1. So what we'll do is we'll go into arm 1 strength, and then we're going to turn off the repeat. We're going to turn that back to constant. And you see right now that that is coming in and it's stopping its rotation right at frame 70. And you know what? That's actually pretty good because the arm is stopping. It's like it's sensing that there's a receptor nearby and it's going to stop the wobbling. And that's right when the antibody is going to come in and bind. So we come in. There we are. Now it's attached. The one thing I don't really care for about this, though, is that it's like it's coming in, it's hitting this receptor. It's like it's just this immovable object. It's like, you know, that this antibody is bigger compared to this receptor. And yeah, this receptor is anchored to the surface of the cell, but the cell is filled with fluid. It's a very organic, undulating mass. You know, it's not like it's going to be anchored within concrete or something. So what can we do to maybe give this a little bit more life? Well, what we can do is we can add in a little overshoot and then a bit of recoil. To do that, simply, I think what I'll do is I'm going to take these keyframes right here from where the antibody is coming in. I'm going to duplicate these. We'll drag them out to the next second, let's say, full second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to take the antibody here, move ahead a few frames. I'm going to move it into the receptor. And we'll set ourselves a keyframe. So now when this comes in, it's going to come in, it's going to bind, and then it's going to slowly back out. All right, that works. But now it's penetrating into the receptor. So what can we do here? Well, I'm going to add in an FFD. And we'll add this a few more subdivisions here in the vertical. And what we can do is we can add a pose morph to this FFD. Go into point mode. So now when this is making contact, if we go into point mode with our rectangle selection key here, we can just kind of mush this whole thing around as though this thing is just getting a little compressed and just shoved over by the antibody as it comes in. Now, it's important to keep in mind the principles of animation here. You know, we don't want this to ideally we don't want this to really lose volume. We just want this to kind of squish and nudge around a little bit. And so by adjusting our FFD right here, that might be good enough. If we set our keyframe at 76 when the antibody first comes into contact, jump ahead to 80, maximum, and then back at the end of the recoil. If we hit play, and we'll shut off this FFD for the time being and see how this, I think that's looking a lot better than that bend deformer was. There's always tons of different ways to set up this sort of secondary action. I like the FFD. I really like the bend deformer if it'll work, but it doesn't always work that smoothly. So in this instance, the FFD or sometimes the correction deformer both work really well. Now, one last thing that I think we should add to this is once it's bound, it just kind of stays there and it's just anchored there. So to add a little bit more interest, what we can do is we can go in and add a vibrate tag, shut off the position, and we'll just leave the rotation enabled. Might drop this down a little bit. So now after it binds, it's still attached. It's attached securely, but it gives it a little bit more life, a little bit more interest, that it comes in and it binds, and then it just kind of sits there and wobbles nice and organically and gives a nice secondary animation, secondary motion to it without a whole lot of effort on our part. The last method I want to talk about is using the cluster deformer, or the cluster tool. Now, the cluster tool is something that is used traditionally in facial animation. It's where you can define a set of vertices to be controlled by a control handle. You can animate the position, rotation, and of a particular handle, or usually it's a null object, and then that will grab the points and deform the face of a character. So I want to use that though to animate this antibody. So let's get rid of everything that we've animated so far on this, and I'm going to get rid of the vibrate tag, and we'll just zero all of this out one more time. And in this instance, I'm going to take the central null, the parent topmost null, and move it right back to the root, kind of the middle of the antibody, and you'll see why in a little bit. I still have on here the vertex maps that we created earlier from the bend deformer rigging technique. And I'm going to use those to control where the cluster deformer influences the movement of these vertices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift, I'm going to go to the character menu, and I'm going to go to the cluster tool. And we will go into the object then, and we'll add in arm1, and we'll set the control target null for that particular cluster. I'm going to call this arm1 control. And now if we move this around, we have the ability to move all the points that are being influenced by that vertex map. We'll call this arm1. I'm going to duplicate that. We'll call this one arm2. We'll drag in arm2 vertex map. We'll clear out that handle, and we want to set a new one. So arm2. We'll call this arm2 control. Now, having these control nulls right here in the center of the antibody makes it a little cumbersome to actually animate when we want to control the ends of the antibody. So what we can do is we can duplicate these, and we'll go into our naming tool, and we'll get rid of control.1 and replace it with handle. I need to make sure that I turn off my axis tool here, because that may cause some problems later on. So let's take a look at arm control 2 is controlling the one on the left. So I'm going to move arm2 handle up to the top and left. Likewise with arm1 handle, and then tail handle down towards the tail. So if we make each of the control nulls children of their respective handles that we just created, now we have a handle up here towards the tip of the arm that is controlling the control null as a child. should be all set. So now what we can do is grab all three of these and drop these as a child of the antibody rig. And we have the ability to animate freely, just like we did before. So let's set our timeline back to 0 to 240 once again. And we're going to set this antibody to come in and bind. Let's get rid of this animation. We won't be needing these at the moment. But a lot of times with the antibody, you see that we've got these two arms. So what that means is that a lot of times these antibodies have the ability to bind to two different receptors at the same time. Now, getting them to bind is one thing, but what happens if each of these particular receptors, let's just move this over in space and rotate them around, okay, looking good, that it would be very straightforward to do if these receptors were static, they were not moving in space. But if they were, let's give them a vibrate tag, and I'm going to shut off the rotation, shut off the X, and the Z, so we're only bouncing around in the Y. There we go, they're bouncing around. You notice that they're bouncing perfectly synchronously at this moment. So in order to eliminate that, all we got to do is change the seed value. And now we have the ability to see them bouncing independent of one another. Awesome. So what we've got here is we've got our antibody, and we've got the number one handle. Let's actually bring that in a little bit. That looks like that was stretching that out. And let's go back to frame 0. We'll set this up here somewhere. It's going to come in, and we'll set our keyframe. We'll come in, let's say frame 72. We'll drop this down, rotate it, and we'll move it over just about like so. And then we'll set our another keyframe. And then at frame 80, let's actually get this down to where this is bound. Straighten them out. Let's make sure front to back. Maybe a little bit like that. Awesome. Okay, so there's our animation. This guy comes in, he swoops in from up above, pauses ever so slightly, and then he comes in. I should have keyframed it. Didn't look like that did. Okay. Anyways, so there it popped up. For some reason, my keyframe didn't pop up there. Anyways, all right. So right now at frame 80, everything's good to go. But as soon as we move forward in time, we see that the receptors are bouncing along, and the antibody's not sticking with them. It's not actually bound. Well, what we can do is we can use a constraint tag in order to bind these handles to the receptors. So if we go in, we right click and we go to rigging tags, we go to constraint, we're going to use a transform constraint. But what we need is we need something for these handles to stick to. Right now, we want them to stick to the receptor, but here's where this handle is, and here's where this receptor is. You see where the axis is down here compared to where this axis is right here. Well, we can't just constrain it like that. So what we can do is we can grab both of these two, and we can use a command called convert to nulls. And now we have arm handle 2, arm handle 1, and let's see here. So this is on number 2. That's going to be a child of the first receptor, and then this one's going to be a child of the second receptor. So if we click on these two and we watch, now these nulls are actually bouncing up and down, in maintaining the relationship with the receptors. So we've got arm handle 1. We'll drag that in, and then we've got arm handle 2. We'll drag that respective one in. Now if we move forward, we see that this receptor maintains perfect registration with these, the antibody arms maintains perfect registration with the receptors as they're vibrating in space. Now what happens if we go to the other side of frame 80? Well, the two arms are stuck to the receptor, but the tail is not, and so that one is following its original keyframed animation. So we got a whole Stretch Armstrong thing going on right now. So what we need to do is we need to actually keyframe the strength of these constraints. So what we'll do is we'll go at frame 80. We'll grab both of these for the time being. We'll adjust them shortly, and we'll go back about 4 frames, and we'll drop that down to a strength of 0. Now, it works, they've let go, but you see that there's this stretching that's happened. So if we move up to frame 80, that stretching goes away. What we need to do is we need to keyframe each of these handles and their position and rotation right here at this time and space when everything is in perfect registration with one another. Now, these keyframes don't need to stay here. A lot of times I will take them and I'll move these back to frame 0. And then these are just going to act as like a bookmark. So as the value of the strength of the constraint is animated down to 0, the handles will move back to their original space that they were all the way back here at frame 0. So now to get this nice little snapping motion, what we can do is move this, kind of straddle that first. Oop, let's reverse that. Let's grab this one and have that one bind first. So it's going to come in, snap, snap. There we go. And what we can do one more time here is add a vibrate tag. Give that just a random value of 3, let's say. And that should be, if we watch it, vibrating around. And now the tail that is not constrained to the receptors has its own vibrating seed, in this case value of 3, which is different than the vibrational value, seed value of each of the receptors. So we have this awesome secondary motion while the arms of the antibody remain bound independently to their own respective receptors. All of this secondary movement with very little effort on our part. So that's 3 different ways to rig up a molecule, in this case a monoclonal antibody, not using conventional joint and skin rigging techniques. Each one has their strengths and their weakness, and a lot of it comes down to what action do you need the molecule to do, and that will kind of determine what approach you need to take in order to rig up the molecule that you're looking to rig. I hope you guys found this informative, or at least a little bit entertaining today. Thank you for watching.